So coming up on September 13th, we have the big undisputed super middleweight title fight between Saul Canelo Alvarez and Terence Bud Crawford. This is of course a massive fight, perhaps the highest profile fight this year. Both men are multi-division world champions and pound for pound stars. Crawford is actually a 2-division undisputed champ at junior welterweight and welterweight, and Canelo is the current undisputed super middleweight champ. So Crawford is making quite the step up in weight to go up and fight Canelo. Crawford is the current WBA junior middleweight world champion, but he won that title in his one and only fight in that weight category. So if we deem Crawford a welterweight, then he is stepping up 3 weight classes to take on Canelo. And remember, Canelo is actually even a former light heavyweight champion. So the fact that Crawford is making such a jump up in weight just adds to the intrigue and appeal of this fight, right? A few years ago, the only way that Canelo Alvarez and Terence Crawford's names would have been uttered in the same sentence is when talking about the pound for pound rankings, but a fight with each other would have been unthinkable. Now that the fight is happening, it's still unthinkable, right? Moving up to fight the main man at super middleweight without even ever having fought at middleweight once, let alone getting a feel of super middleweight beforehand. Talk about rolling the dice and daring to be great, right? How often do boxers move up more than one weight class to win a world title off of the guy who is actually the man of the division at the time? The only case that immediately springs to my mind is when Michael Spinks moved straight up from light heavyweight to heavyweight to take on Larry Holmes. Holmes, who was the undefeated reigning and defending IBF and lineal heavyweight champ, held the WBC title during that lineal reign too and vacated. So Larry Holmes weren't just some belt holder by any means. And Michael Spinks pulled off the upset and won the title off of Holmes in a 15-round unanimous decision victory. A truly historical feat from Michael Spinks there. And if Crawford can defeat Canelo in September, it will be a historical feat to that level. So with all that history that can be made there, surely Canelo vs Crawford is a fight to look forward to, right? But here's the thing, there really is so much you can say to critique the existence of this upcoming fight between Crawford and Canelo. So we just briefly touched on how this fight is Crawford daring to be great. But what does it do for Canelo? Well, he's getting a load of dosh to fight a guy from a much lower weight class, but credibility wise, if he wins, then well done. He's beat a welterweight who's coming all the way up to super middleweight, in a fight that some might even call a cherry pick from Canelo. Despite Crawford's greatness, the vast weight advantage on Canelo's side makes it a cherry pick surely. Just to go along with Canelo's recent heavily criticised fight and victory over Jermell Charlo, who skipped up from 154 and got the shot at his undisputed crown. Or other recent opponents who Canelo fought, such as John Ryder and Edgar Berlanga, cherry picking those guys having never fought David Benavidez, who was the top contender at 168, right? And then if Crawford does pull off the upset and beats Canelo, then Canelo is just a bum, right? For losing to the much smaller man. But then, not everything is all fine and dandy from the part of Crawford just because he's the one stepping up and daring to be great. So he's coming off of his 12-round unanimous decision victory over Israel Madrimov in his junior middleweight debut back on August 3rd of 2024. So not only is he getting a shot at the undisputed super middleweight crown in his debut in that weight class over all of the contenders at 168, but he's getting it off of a long stint of inactivity. It's going to have been over a year out of the ring for Bud by the time he fights Canelo in September, with Canelo having fought twice since he last fought, against Edgar Berlanga and William Skull. And on that note, as for Canelo's latest fight with William Skull, the purpose of that fight was for Canelo to get that IBF belt back that he was stripped of. This lesser known and unproven contender in Skull got a hold of that belt in a vacant title fight. So Canelo had to go on this side quest and get that IBF belt back, and we had to sit through those 12 boring rounds of boxing. Also, this big super fight with Crawford could be for undisputed gold. So essentially, Crawford just got to sit there and wait for Canelo to get that IBF belt back, and not fight anyone himself in the meantime, so he could get a shot at the undisputed title in a weight class 2 categories above the one that he's currently a champion in. But speaking of Crawford vs Madrimov and Canelo vs Skull, well yeah, you could say that both Canelo and Crawford are not coming off of the greatest performances. Crawford vs Madrimov was a decent fight that picked up as it went on, but it wasn't the most convincing winner from Bud. He struggled quite a bit in his 154 debut there, getting caught with a lot of right hands and not being able to hurt Madrimov, thus ending his 11-fight knockout streak. Then for Canelo vs Skull, it was an absolute stinkfest that broke the record for the lowest total punches thrown in a 12-round fight in history. Skull literally just ran away, but Canelo also pretty much just stood there at times and failed to cut the ring off, so he didn't win the fight by a very wide margin. Well, not on one of the official cards at least, and I do agree with that 115 to 113 card. So this Canelo vs Crawford fight is the fight between two old fighters who are several weight classes apart and are both coming off of questionable performances. Selling this upcoming fight as a super fight must be a scam, right? But now, the other week we had the Chris Eubank Jr. vs Conor Benn fight, which compares to Canelo vs Crawford in that the fans were also very vocal about the drawbacks of that fight going into it. The two men were in separate weight classes, just like Canelo and Crawford. But in the case of Chris Eubank Jr. and Conor Benn, there was also all of the talk about them both being mediocre boxers who are just living off of the hype of their fathers' names, and their own career accomplishments would never warrant anywhere near that much hype if it wasn't for Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank Sr. But when Eubank Jr. vs Conor Benn took place, it was an absolute war for their ages, and most people were very pleased with the spectacle that they got in the ring, despite the truth around the drawbacks going into that fight not being changed by the fact that they just ended up having a fun scrap. So to link that back to Canelo and Crawford, despite this actually being a much higher level fight than the Eubank Jr. vs Conor Benn fight, a lot of the criticisms surrounding this upcoming fight are fairly valid, so I'm not going to accuse all of the detractors of this fight of being contrarians. The fans do have the right to criticise this, but at the end of the day, the fight is official now, so all we can do is just hope that the fight does deliver in the ring to pay off for all of the hype, just like Chris Eubank Jr. vs Conor Benn did. But the fundamental question is, does Canelo vs Crawford even have the makings of a fun fight? Is it actually shaping up to be boring? So yes, Canelo's very last fight against William Skull was a very boring one. Onus was on Canelo to push the action a bit more, but Skull did not want to engage at all. And a lot of people would deem Skull as the main perpetrator for that fight's lack of entertainment value. He had never fought at that level before and didn't want to know about Canelo's power. And then the last time Canelo fought someone jumping up from 154 to challenge him for his 168-pound titles was Jermell Charlo, and he didn't come to engage, did he? That weren't a great fight at all. Now I know that Terence Crawford is by no means William Skull, nor Jermell Charlo. Crawford is the dynamic, tough and gritty boxer puncher who's never been known to run. Surely he'll stand and bang with Canelo, right? He stood there and stayed fully engaged with the 154-pound champion Majmov in his debut of that weight class. However, there is a first time for everything. And although Crawford running away may seem unfeasible because he is indeed a built different kind of guy, moving all the way up to super middleweight would be the incentive to move around the ring a lot and refrain from engaging, if anything. So I shouldn't compare Crawford to William Skull because Crawford is a much greater fighter, of course. But in an interview on the Stomping Ground, Eddie Hearn claims that at the Canelo vs Skull fight, after the 8th round, he asked Crawford how he had the fight scored to that point, and Crawford answered, "I've got Skull winning easily." So if we're taking Eddie's word for that, Crawford must have perceived Skull's strategy against Canelo as effective. So who's to say that Crawford won't replicate Skull's performance to an extent, but just do a little more of the punches so he can actually nick it on the cards possibly. And as for Jermell Charlo, we know Terence Crawford is absolutely built different to Charlo. But remember, people give credit to Crawford for staying engaged with Majmov in his one and only fight at junior middleweight. But Jermell Charlo was a career junior middleweight. He was fighting at 154 back when Crawford was just a lightweight. And remember, Jermell didn't want to know about Canelo's power in that ring. There was the reluctance to engage, and he took that knee in the 7th round because he didn't like the feel of Canelo's super middleweight power. And that was just after getting hit on the forehead. So not that Majmov ever hurt Crawford or looked significantly stronger than him at all in that fight, but if Crawford moving up to 154 was meant to be this big thing, then going straight up 2 weight classes from that in his very next fight is a whole different extreme. So maybe Crawford gets in there and just doesn't fancy engaging when he feels Canelo's super middleweight strength and power, and does pull off what the career 154 pounder and naturally bigger fighter Jermell Charlo did. Even though it seems unlikely that Crawford will fight in that boring fashion, or that's what most people are making out, please believe that he definitely can if he wanted to. If William Skull can play it safe and get touched that little by Canelo, height and reach aside, with Crawford's athleticism and foot speed, he can fight in a way that Canelo practically doesn't get near him for the whole fight if he really wanted to. And how much work Crawford gets in himself in the process, whether more or less than Skull, is a whole different story. But even if he does outpoint Canelo fairly comprehensively on the back foot, as long as he doesn't land anything too big, which Skull didn't do by any stretch, they'll give it to Canelo on the card for being the aggressor. I do believe that Canelo should be held accountable for doing more to set traps and cut the ring off in order to actually get a decent volume of scoring punches in certain fights. But trust me, the judges would score it to Canelo on the fact that he's coming forward if Crawford does go on the back foot the whole fight and just outlands him. And in regards to the scares that this fight will be boring and give everyone something to complain about, in that scenario I just mentioned, half the people will be saying that Canelo is a fraud who won a robbery against a much lighter man, and the other half would say that Crawford stunk the place out and ran away. Well, logical people would acknowledge both realities. But an important question is whether or not the size difference is really enough to make Crawford switch up from the fighter we know him to be from recent times. Because even the most casual of fans, or people that are not even really boxing fans at all, are just going on about the size difference, just because the two men are multiple weight classes apart. However, there's this argument going around that Canelo is not actually a bigger man than Terence Crawford. Crawford is about 1.5 inches taller and possibly walks around at a similar weight to Canelo. But that argument is not very strong because of the fact that Canelo has fought in professional competition with the 10-ounce gloves at super middleweight 11 times, and twice at light heavyweight. That makes all the difference because that's where it counts. Canelo is not a big super middleweight at all, but he is a good super middleweight, that's for sure. He's undefeated in the weight class and is accustomed to dishing out damage and absorbing damage from these big guys in actual fights. 4 stoppages at super middleweight and 11 knockdowns. And he's of course gotten in there twice with light heavies as well, with the 1 stoppage win. So the way I see it, Crawford could be 3 inches taller than Canelo. He could walk around over a stone heavier than Canelo. He could be lifting twice the amount that Canelo does in the weights room. And he could be sparring heavyweights in the gym. That doesn't make up for Canelo's experience of actually fighting bigger guys in competition. And remember, Crawford's never even fought at middleweight before, let alone super middle, and he is a former lightweight. So perhaps the casual fans aren't privy to all of that and won't be able to elaborate on the weight differential in such a fashion, but when they bang on about the weight difference, as repetitive as it can be, it is right, and it is the overbearing factor of this fight. Well, I'd like to call it the weight class difference. And I don't say all of that weight class difference stuff to rubbish off the existence of this fight myself, but I'm suggesting that it is enough of a factor to give us a different Crawford in there, i.e. one who's on his bike for 12 rounds, which of course wouldn't mix well with Canelo, who hasn't pushed the action much in his recent fights. But the main point of this video is to say that this upcoming fight better be an exciting one. And I don't particularly think that Crawford will run from Canelo. I don't even really think there is a 50% chance of it. But I do want to highlight that it is very possible due to the aforementioned weight factors. And Crawford is not exclusively a front foot fighter at all, so he will be the one retreating. It's just whether or not he actually runs. But what has to happen for this fight to even be entertaining though? Well, an obvious way is for it to be a back and forth war with both men hurting each other, a fight with numerous big moments. A moment that would definitely be massive would be Crawford hurting Canelo at any point. Because although Canelo has certainly been bothered by punches, been outboxed, and been caught with big shots in the past, he's never really been hurt. Apart from that one time against Miguel Cotto's brother back in the day, but he was just 19 years old then. And against Golovkin in the rematch he was a bit shaken but still upright on his feet, and that's Golovkin. So however this fight goes, if Crawford can rock Canelo then that would be huge. If Canelo hurts or even drops Crawford, then it's nothing too crazy because Crawford is the smaller man. But if Canelo stops Crawford, then in my opinion, that would be big regardless of the size difference, as Crawford has never been stopped before and is undefeated. And as for Terence Crawford actually beating Canelo, let alone just hurting him, it would be great to see Crawford pull off the upset. But again, regardless of the fan narrative going into the fight, or the narratives that will come as a result of the fight, let's just hope that it's a really exciting fight with big unexpected moments in it. Personally, I am looking forward to the fight. It's not a fight that we've all been begging for, and we would have rather seen Canelo defend his 168-pound titles against Benavidez, or even Morrell. I would have liked that one. But they've both gone up to light heavy now, so that ship has kind of sailed for now, and it is what it is. And I'm not overly fussed about seeing Canelo fight any of the current contenders at super middle. Not fussed about any of the rematches with the guys he's already beat, apart from maybe Caleb Plant down the line, depending on how his next couple fights go. And I'm not fussed about seeing Canelo versus Diego Pacheco at all. And then Mbili, maybe that could be Canelo's next defense if he beats Crawford and then stays at 168. So Canelo versus Crawford, I'm fine with it really. I'm not going to glorify it too much and try to shut down all the criticisms or anything like that, but I will be watching it. And I reiterate, I hope it ends up being a good fight above all. That's all I really have to say on Canelo versus Crawford for now, but perhaps if I get more hype for it closer to the time, then I'll do a few more videos on it. But yeah, thank you for listening to this video. A special thank you to all of you who have been supporting the work on a regular basis. For those of you who are new, please do like and subscribe. Comment your thoughts down below about the Canelo versus Crawford fight. And you have been listening to O.M.E. Boxing.